January 1943. Michigan's winter air cuts like glass. Outside Detroit, the flatlands lie buried under snow, silent, endless, frozen. But beyond the fields, rising from the white horizon, a thunder grows. Not from the sky, but from the ground itself. Inside a building a mile long, the night never ends. Floodlights blaze against steel girders. The floor trembles under the weight of machinery. Sparks flash like miniature lightning as welders seal the bones of a bomber. Overhead, cranes swing wings into place with mechanical grace. At the far end of the hall, an enormous door opens to daylight. Another B-24 Liberator, polished aluminum, twin tails gleaming, rolls out toward the runway. Its engines cough, then roar to life. Every 63 minutes, another one follows. A bomber an hour, 1,000 a month. Across the ocean, in the bunkers of Berlin, German intelligence officers stare at the figures in disbelief. No sabotage, no bombing raid, no resource shortage can stop it. The Allies have created something terrifying, an assembly line for war itself. And it began here, at a place called Willow Run. In 1940, the world teetered on the edge of darkness. Across Europe, Hitler's armies moved like a machine, nations collapsing in weeks beneath the precision of blitzkrieg. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. Britain stood alone, its cities burning under the nightly assault of the Luftwaffe. In America, the mood was divided. Isolation ran deep. The trauma of the Great War still haunted homes, families, and factories. But the radio crackled each night with reports from London. Children sleeping in subway tunnels, fighter pilots burning in the skies. Slowly, the United States began to realize that oceans no longer guaranteed safety. President Franklin Roosevelt called for what seemed impossible. In a fireside address in December 1940, he spoke calmly, his words measured, deliberate. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." The phrase struck a chord. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was a challenge. If Britain and the free world were to survive, America would have to supply the weapons. Not dozens, not hundreds, but tens of thousands. At that time, U.S. aircraft production was still modest, roughly 6,000 planes a year. Factories designed for peacetime consumer goods struggled to imagine how to build complex bombers at scale. Airplanes were handcrafted machines, built in small numbers by engineers and skilled artisans. Every rivet was placed by hand. Every airframe took weeks. That would not be enough. By 1941, Roosevelt's planners demanded production in the hundreds of thousands. Fighters, transports, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft. A new kind of industry had to be born, one that could fuse the precision of aviation with the speed of automotive mass production. In Detroit, this challenge stirred something familiar. The men who had revolutionized the automobile, Henry Ford, Charles Sorensen, and their engineers, had spent decades perfecting the assembly line. They could build a Model T in under 90 minutes. But a 4-engine heavy bomber? That was an entirely different world. Yet the timing was critical. The British urgently needed long-range bombers capable of carrying massive payloads deep into occupied Europe. Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego had designed the B-24 Liberator, a plane faster, higher flying, and longer range than the older B-17. But Consolidated couldn't meet the demand alone. In 1941, the U.S. government approached the Ford Motor Company. They wanted something unprecedented, for an automobile manufacturer to mass-produce aircraft on an industrial scale. Ford agreed. with hesitation, ambition, and a sense of destiny. Henry Ford, then nearly 80, was skeptical of war production. A pacifist and industrial purist, he loathed the idea of building weapons. But his son, Edsel Ford, saw the larger picture. America's survival and the defense of freedom might depend on what Detroit could build. The Ford engineers began studying the B-24's blueprints. They were stunned. Each aircraft contained more than 1.2 million parts, thousands of precision rivets, intricate hydraulic systems, and complex wiring. It was nothing like a car. But Charles Sorensen, Ford's production genius, saw a path forward. He proposed to build a new kind of factory, vast enough to house not just assembly lines, but entire sublines for wings, engines, fuselages, and tail sections. Every part would move continuously, converging at the end into a completed bomber. It was an industrial vision as bold as anything the modern world had seen. The location would be a stretch of farmland outside Ypsilanti, Michigan, chosen for its flat terrain and proximity to Detroit's skilled labor. The design called for a structure so large that it would later be called the Grand Canyon under a roof. In April 1941, ground was broken. Bulldozers carved out foundations under freezing rain. Workers poured miles of concrete while architects revised blueprints overnight. When finished, the plant would cover 3.5 million square feet, with a mile-long assembly line and a dedicated airfield at one end. To the men and women who first walked its corridors, Willow Run looked less like a factory and more like a city of steel. But beyond the architecture lay a greater test. The Ford engineers could build cars by the thousands, but could they build bombers fast enough to change the course of a global war? That question would soon be answered in the roar of engines and the rhythm of rivet guns. And it would begin with the first aircraft to roll off the line. By mid-1941, the bare fields of Ypsilanti were no longer quiet. The landscape trembled beneath the surge of construction. Steel skeletons rose into the sky. Cranes swung in constant motion, and concrete mixers worked around the clock under floodlights that turned night into day. The new factory at Willow Run was like nothing the modern world had ever seen. A single building, over a mile long, with enough interior space to fit several New York skyscrapers laid end to end. The blueprints called for assembly lines longer than city blocks, continuous conveyor systems for wings and fuselages, and tunnels carrying fuel, power, and compressed air. Henry Ford wanted perfection, clean geometry, strict order, and machine logic. But reality quickly defied the dream. The B-24 Liberator was not designed for mass production. Its thin, high-mounted wing and complex Davis airfoil demanded precise alignment. Even the smallest deviation could cripple performance. The plane had over 450,000 separate operations during the assembly. For Ford's engineers, it was like trying to mass-produce a watch the size of a bus. Inside the plant, the first trial assemblies revealed chaos. Car engineers and aircraft specialists argued over tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Rivet guns jammed, aluminum sheets warped under pressure. Tooling errors multiplied. When the Army Air Force's inspectors arrived, they found misaligned parts and leaky hydraulic systems. Yet Ford's team refused to back down. Charles "Cast Iron Charlie" Sorensen, Ford's hard-edged production chief, took personal control. He walked the line daily, clipboard in hand, studying every delay. He re-engineered the plant's workflow, segmenting assembly into sections, each feeding into the next with relentless precision. You don't build an airplane. You build parts of it, then assemble the Air Force.
Meanwhile, the workforce grew into an army of its own. By the time the plant was fully operational, over 40,000 people worked at Willow Run. They came from farms, small towns, and across the Midwest, men too old for combat and women entering industry for the first time. Among them were former mechanics, housewives, school teachers, and machinists who had never seen an aircraft up close. Training was frantic. The need was urgent. Ford built dormitories, cafeterias, and even a small city to support them. Buses ran from Detroit to Ypsilanti daily, ferrying thousands through the early morning fog. Inside the plant, the rhythmic thunder of hammers and drills created a constant industrial heartbeat. But the challenges were immense. The plant's sheer size made climate control almost impossible. In winter, frost formed on the rivets. In summer, temperatures soared above 100 degrees. Snow blew through the loading bays. Entire sections of the floor had to be redesigned to handle the weight of completed bombers. By early 1942, when the U.S. formally entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Willow Run was still struggling. Production delays mounted. Ford promised one bomber a day, but none were rolling off the line. The press called it Ford's folly. Skeptics said airplanes couldn't be built like cars. Then the tide began to turn. Sorensen and his engineers tore apart the line again, rearranging it to match the natural order of assembly. Fuselage first, wings second, engines and systems last. Gradually the rhythm settled. Teams worked in shifts day and night. Every adjustment was logged, every mistake analyzed. In September 1942, the first fully Ford-built B-24 Liberator rolled out of Willow Run. It was far from perfect, but it flew, a gleaming symbol of industrial persistence. As more followed, the line began to move faster. Ford's workers learned by doing, mastering their craft under unrelenting pressure. By mid-1943, production soared beyond all expectation. Where once it took months to hand-build a bomber, now one left the line every hour. Across the Atlantic, Allied airfields began to fill with silver wings, aircraft stamped "Made in Ypsilanti." For the first time, Hitler's generals realized they were fighting an enemy that could replace in days what Germany took months to build. Willow Run had become not just a factory, but a symbol of American resolve, the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy. And while the machines thundered on, a quieter story unfolded inside, of human hands, exhaustion, and pride. Because behind every bomber's gleaming skin were the fingerprints of thousands of ordinary people working against time to save a world in flames.
At Willow Run, the war was not fought with rifles or tanks. It was fought with wrenches, rivet guns, and human endurance. The industrial angle, the machine that built the sky. What Ford achieved at Willow Run was not merely production, it was transformation. Before the war, an aircraft was a piece of craftsmanship. At Willow Run, it became a product of process. Ford engineers applied the same logic that once built the Model T. Divide labor into precise tasks, each repeatable and measurable. Conveyor belts carried wings across the plant. Hydraulic lifts raised fuselage sections into the air. Subassemblies from remote plants in Detroit and Cleveland arrived by truck and rail, feeding a vast logistical web. Every hour, hundreds of workers completed small but vital motions: drilling, riveting, wiring, polishing. Each movement was studied, timed, and refined. Efficiency became sacred. To a visitor, the sight was almost surreal, a river of metal and sweat stretching from one end of the factory to the other. Engines were tested on the left wing as the right was still being attached. Electricians and mechanics worked shoulder to shoulder in a coordinated ballet of noise and light. The air shimmered with heat. Floodlights burned without pause.
Forklifts hummed between stations like worker bees. And at the far end, sunlight poured through open hangar doors as another silver bomber rolled toward flight. It was industrial choreography on a scale the world had never seen. Every 63 minutes, the Earth trembled as a new aircraft left the line, wings wide, engines roaring, destined for war. The machine worked, but it was powered not by gears and oil. It was powered by people. The human angle, hands of the arsenal. They came from everywhere. Farmers from Ohio, miners from Kentucky, mothers from Michigan, refugees from the Dust Bowl. Some had never touched a power tool before. Others had built cars all their lives. Together, they became something new: industrial soldiers. By 1943, more than one-third of Willow Run's workforce were women. They wore overalls, tied their hair in scarves, and learned to handle rivet guns heavier than they were. They worked 12-hour shifts in heat and noise, often under impossible deadlines. They called themselves the Rosies. They weren't on the front lines, but their work was no less dangerous. Burns, metal splinters, and chemical exposure were constant hazards. Yet few complained. Every bomber finished meant fewer sons and brothers lost overseas. The rhythm of the plant shaped their lives. Babies were born while fathers worked nights. Cafeterias served 20,000 meals a day. Trains brought workers in at dawn and carried the exhausted home by moonlight. In the middle of it all stood Edsel Ford, quiet, thin, and often pale from illness. While his father's name dominated the headlines, Edsel was the bridge between war necessity and corporate tradition. He personally visited the factory floor, shaking hands with workers, listening to complaints, and urging perseverance. But behind the triumph, there was cost. The noise was constant, the pace relentless. Workers collapsed at their stations. Others were replaced without notice. Absenteeism was punished harshly. Each bomber carried not just aluminum and fuel, but fatigue, sacrifice, and the quiet resolve of those who built it. Still, morale held. The war gave purpose to exhaustion. Posters hung on walls. The faster you build, the sooner they'll come home. It was not just an assembly line. It was hope turned into motion. The technological angle, the B-24, the Liberator. At the center of it all was the machine that justified the effort. The consolidated B-24 Liberator. It was not beautiful. Its lines were square and its fuselage bulbous, but it was one of the most capable bombers of the war. With 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines, it could fly over 2,000 miles with a payload of 8,000 pounds of bombs. It could climb higher and fly faster than the famous B-17. The Liberator's signature feature was his Davis wing, a thin, high-aspect ratio design that gave remarkable lift but required precision manufacturing. Small errors could render it unstable. For Ford, building thousands of such wings meant rethinking how precision could exist on an assembly line. Each aircraft demanded nearly 60,000 separate drawings, thousands of hand-fit components, and over 335,000 rivets. The oxygen system alone had 8,000 parts. To meet these demands, Ford developed entirely new tooling methods: adjustable jigs, modular fixtures, and simplified sub-assemblies that allowed workers with minimal training to achieve aircraft-grade precision. They automated riveting sequences, color-coded wire harnesses, and standardized hydraulic lines. Every improvement saved minutes, and minutes, multiplied by thousands, became bombers. It wasn't just a production miracle, it was an engineering revolution. By merging Detroit's mass production culture with aerospace precision, Ford changed not only the pace of the war, but the future of manufacturing itself. When the first B-24s from Willow Run reached England, they bore names painted in white across the nose: Yankee Doodle, Detroit Miss, Ford's Folly. The crews who flew them sometimes joked about the rough welds and uneven panels, but they trusted the planes. The Liberator could take damage, limp home on one engine, and still deliver its crew alive. Each one was a flying testament to human perseverance, the spirit of ordinary Americans turned into metal and flame. And far from Michigan, in the bunkers of occupied Europe, men in gray uniforms began to realize that this factory, this single heartbeat of industry, might have already doomed them. Because Willow Run was only the beginning.
The leadership angle: Henry, Edsel, and Sorensen. At the heart of Willow Run's creation stood three men, each representing a different America. Henry Ford, the visionary of the automobile age, was nearing 80. His name was synonymous with industrial power, but he was a man out of time, distrustful of bankers, politicians, and modern warfare. His isolationist views had made him a controversial figure, even as the world plunged into conflict. He despised waste, disorder, and compromise. And yet his factories, his methods, and his machines were now the cornerstone of the Allied war effort. Edsel Ford, his son, carried the burden of leadership under his father's shadow. Sensitive and diplomatic, Edsel understood both the moral necessity and the business reality of war production. He believed industry could serve humanity without losing its soul. While Henry clung to control, Edsel worked with Washington, the War Department, and the Army Air Forces to make Willow Run functional. His health, already fragile, deteriorated under the strain. He often spent nights at his desk, signing off on production changes, reviewing schedules, and calming conflicts. He would not live to see the war's end. Charles Sorensen, meanwhile, embodied the relentless pragmatism of industrial America. A man of iron focus, known to his workers simply as Cast Iron Charlie, Sorensen had built Ford's empire of moving lines. At Willow Run, he became the driving force, solving problems others called impossible. He bullied engineers, defied bureaucrats, and worked himself to exhaustion. When Ford's aircraft experts said the B-24 was too complex for mass production, Sorensen replied simply, "Then we'll change production until it isn't." The tension among these men defined the factory's soul. Henry wanted perfection. Sorensen demanded speed. Edsel sought harmony between the two. The pressure from Washington only grew. General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, demanded output beyond imagination. The war, he told them, will be won by those who can build faster. The Ford men understood. They weren't just building machines, they were building time itself. Every hour saved at Willow Run meant lives spared on the battlefield. And across the ocean, the enemy was watching. The enemy angle: German intelligence and industrial despair. By late 1943, the Reich's intelligence agencies began to piece together reports that defied logic. From intercepted cables, from captured documents, and from reconnaissance photos, they learned that American factories were producing aircraft at rates no one had thought possible. Factories like Willow Run were not just making planes, they were creating air fleets in real time. Within a year, the United States was outproducing Germany by a factor of 10 in combat aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was now bleeding pilots and fuel faster than replacements could be found. German analysts initially dismissed the numbers as Allied propaganda. A bomber an hour? 1,000 a month? Impossible. But by mid-1944, the skies over Europe told a different story. Formation after formation of B-24s darkened the daylight, hundreds at a time stretching horizon to horizon. Engines droned like thunder over the Ruhr, Hamburg, and Berlin. Bombing raids that once involved a few dozen aircraft now came in waves of hundreds. Even when the Luftwaffe shot them down, the Allies replaced them within days. Captured German officers would later admit their disbelief. "We had no answer," said General Adolf Galland. "They could build faster than we could destroy." The despair reached the highest ranks. In Führer conferences, Albert Speer,
Hitler's armaments minister, warned that German production, even at full efficiency, could not compete. Germany had brilliance, precision, and courage. America had Willow Run. It wasn't just a factory, it was a weapon of scale, a demonstration that democracy, when mobilized, could wield industrial power greater than totalitarianism ever could. For the men in the bunkers, watching entire cities burn from above, the sound of approaching bombers was no longer just an air raid. It was the echo of a system they could not defeat. The moral angle, the weight of industrial war. As Willow Run reached its stride, an unease grew beneath the triumph. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of bombs, millions of gallons of fuel. For many workers, the question lingered, what were they building, and at what cost? They weren't soldiers. They didn't see the destruction. But they knew where those bombers were going. Dresden, Hamburg, Ploesti. They knew that each aircraft leaving the line carried a payload measured in death. The war demanded it. The enemy had to be crushed. But in the quiet moments, between shifts, some felt the contradiction. The pride of creation entangled with the burden of consequence. Newspapers and radio broadcasts framed it as necessity. This was the price of freedom. Yet within the plant, conversation sometimes drifted into the moral fog of industrial warfare. Could progress itself become a weapon? Could efficiency, stripped of purpose, become its own kind of violence? The line never stopped long enough for answers. The world was burning too quickly. And still, the workers returned every day. They didn't speak of philosophy or geopolitics. They thought of husbands at the front, brothers on ships, sons in the Pacific. For them, every rivet was a prayer. Every finished plane was a chance, maybe small, maybe enough, to bring someone home. When a bomber left the line, workers often stood to watch it taxi down the runway, its propellers blurring the air. Some cheered, others just simply stood in silence, hands stained with oil, eyes following it until it lifted into the pale Michigan sky. They knew their part in history was made of sweat, steel, and contradictions. And far away, over the Atlantic, their work would soon meet its true test, in the roar of engines above Europe. Because the next chapter of Willow Run's story would not unfold in Michigan, but in the skies of war. By the spring of 1943, the experiment at Willow Run had become a thunderous success and a living contradiction. It was still rough around the edges. The plant leaked in the rain. Machines broke down. Supply chains snarled. But despite all that, the rhythm had become unstoppable. Every 63 minutes, the floor trembled. Another B-24 rolled toward the hangar doors, its aluminum skin gleaming beneath the floodlights. Mechanics fueled the tanks, test pilots climbed aboard, and moments later, the plane was airborne, a fresh Liberator joining the growing armada in the sky. At its peak, Willow Run produced more than 650 bombers per month, approaching the almost mythical goal of 1,000. Other factories across the nation, inspired by its methods, followed suit. Consolidated in San Diego, Douglas in Tulsa, and North American in Kansas City adopted the Ford system. Together, they turned the air war into a storm of metal and fire. By 1943, Allied air supremacy was no longer a dream, it was a measurable fact. Over Europe, the sky filled with the deep, synchronized pulse of 4-engine bombers flying in formation. Crews called it the sound of home, the music of numbers too vast to imagine. The B-24 Liberators, once hand-built machines, were now appearing in fleets, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Painted silver or olive drab, their nicknames covered the fuselage. Hell's Bell, Yankee Doodle, The Witch, Ford's Folly. Each plane carried up to 5 tons of bombs, 10 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, and a crew of 10 men, pilots, gunners, navigators, engineers, ordinary Americans drawn from farms, factories, and schools. The impact was immediate. The air war shifts. In August 1943, more than 170 B-24s launched one of the most daring raids of the war, the attack on the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania. It was one of the Luftwaffe's most vital fuel sources, and destroying it would cripple German logistics. The operation, codenamed Tidal Wave, was a test not only of the B-24's range and durability, but of the industrial miracle that produced it. Many of the bombers in the formation had come directly from Willow Run, their parts stamped, welded, and assembled by workers who had never left Michigan. The raid was catastrophic and heroic. 53 bombers were lost, hundreds of airmen were killed or captured, but the refineries burned for days, and German oil production faltered. For the first time, the industrial output of a single American factory had reached halfway across the world and struck at the heart of Hitler's war machine. The lesson was unmistakable. Numbers could overwhelm strategy. Over the next year, production accelerated even further. Every bomber lost in combat was replaced, sometimes before its absence was even noticed. Airfields in England filled beyond capacity. Rows of Liberators stretched across the countryside, waiting for missions to France, Italy, and Germany. By mid-1944, the Allies had assembled the largest air armada in history, over 11,000 heavy bombers, many of which had their origins at Willow Run. When the bombing of Berlin began in earnest, German civilians described the sight as an eclipse. The sky darkened under the sheer mass of aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. The Luftwaffe, already weakened, threw its remaining fighters into battle. But for every American bomber destroyed, 3 more arrived the next month. Willow Run had changed the arithmetic of war. Back in Michigan, production continued day and night. No holidays, no Sundays. The roar of machinery never ceased. The cafeteria lights stayed on 24 hours. When one shift ended, another began. Some workers began to measure their lives not in weeks or months, but in bombers. You could tell time by them, one riveter later said. When that new plane came out, it was like the clock striking the hour. The plant consumed 1 million pounds of aluminum each day. Trains arrived in endless streams delivering engines, tires, glass, and guns. Outbound, freshly completed bombers took off directly from Willow Run's airfield, flown to final modification centers, then ferried across the Atlantic via Newfoundland and Ireland. By the time a bomber reached an English base, it bore the fingerprints of tens of thousands of anonymous laborers, each one a silent participant in the mission it would fly. And in those moments, when entire fleets took to the air, the workers could look up and know, we built that sky. The enemy watches. From Berlin, the reports grew darker. German armaments minister Albert Speer delivered grim assessments to Hitler. The Allied bomber offensive was destroying cities faster than they could rebuild them. Factories were being dispersed into forests, tunnels, and mountains, desperate attempts to hide from the swarms above. Intelligence suggested that America was producing aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. It wasn't just Willow Run anymore, it was the model it had created. Industrialized warfare had become a contest of systems, not just soldiers. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler raged that the Americans are factories, not men. He wasn't entirely wrong. The Allies had achieved something profound: the translation of national will into mechanical output. Willow Run had shown that democracy could organize itself into a war machine without losing its soul, and in doing so, it broke the psychological advantage of totalitarian speed. The tide of war had shifted, but the storm was not yet over. Because even as the bombers filled the sky, the cost in men, metal, and morality was climbing toward its peak. And in the months to come, Willow Run's greatest triumph would coincide with its most haunting moment.
By late 1944, the war in the air had transformed from daring raids into relentless annihilation. The Allies, once outnumbered and tentative, now ruled the skies with mechanical certainty. From dawn until dusk, the rumble of engines became the soundtrack of occupied Europe. Every sunrise brought new waves of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. The formation seemed endless, silver rivers of metal flowing east toward the Reich. For the German High Command, the turning point came not on a battlefield, but in a conference room. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, presented a report that chilled even hardened generals. Despite heroic efforts to disperse production and repair bombed facilities, output had plateaued. The numbers told a grim truth. Germany was building roughly 2,000 aircraft a month. The Allies were producing 10 times that number. Hitler's generals stared in silence. Every industrial center, every oil field, every transportation hub was now within reach of Allied bombers. No city was safe. No night was quiet. It was an invisible front, one fought not by divisions of men, but by the weight of factories half a world away. A factory's reach. From the skies above Berlin to the docks of Kiel, the mark of Willow Run was everywhere. Liberators hammered U-boat pens on the French coast. Others struck at industrial cities, Kassel, Bremen, Leipzig. Some flew from Italy to hit targets in Austria and Yugoslavia. Each bombing raid was a page written by Detroit's machinery. The crews flying them were young, many barely 20 years old. They trusted the planes completely. The B-24's rugged frame could take brutal punishment and still fly home on shredded wings. Pilots joked that the Willow Run bombers had Detroit steel in their bones. It wasn't far from the truth. The numbers were staggering. By the end of 1944 alone, Willow Run had produced over 8,500 B-24s. When combined with production at other plants, the total neared 18,000, more than any other American heavy bomber of the war. In a single year, Willow Run built more aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe possessed. Each one was a fragment of a much larger idea, that industrial democracy could outbuild tyranny, that freedom itself could be measured in tonnage and horsepower. And for the men on the other side, that realization was devastating. The despair inside the Reich. In late 1944, Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland was summoned to meet with Hitler. The Führer ranted about cowardice, about treachery, about miracles yet to come. Galland, exhausted and hollow-eyed, told him the truth. "The enemy has the factories, my Führer. We have the ruins." Reports from the front painted the same picture. New Luftwaffe pilots, barely trained, were being thrown into combat against Allied formations too vast to count. Fuel shortages grounded entire wings. Airfields lay under constant bombardment. German radar stations tracked formations of 1,000 bombers at a time, approaching from the west. Operators watched in disbelief as they passed, wave after wave. When survivors described the sound, they spoke of it not as noise, but as pressure. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the mechanical heartbeat of America's war machine. By late 1944, Berlin burned nightly. The lights of the city flickered under the pulse of explosions. Fire brigades fought in vain as blocks vanished into flame. Factories were reduced to shells. And somewhere deep underground, in a concrete bunker, Hitler asked a single question: how many more can they have? The answer whispered by his aides, was unbearable, more than we can destroy. Inside Willow Run, triumph and toll. Back in Michigan, the war felt far away, yet its pressure was everywhere. Posters urged speed. Newspapers printed photographs of bomber crews waving from English airfields, surrounded by machines stamped Ford Motor Company. But the work was taking its toll. Workers fell ill from exhaustion. Many had been on the line for 3 years without rest. Some collapsed mid-shift and were carried out on stretchers. Still, the bombers came, one an hour, every hour. In 1944, Willow Run reached its peak, a completed bomber every 55 minutes. Each was test-flown from the factory's runway before being ferried to modification centers and then across the Atlantic. Test pilots described the site of the factory from the air, a gleaming monument of steel and movement, a city devoted entirely to war. The long roof shimmered in sunlight, with dozens of aircraft lined up below like sleeping giants waiting for wings. At night, the horizon glowed faintly orange from the lights inside. For miles, it was visible, the beacon of America's industry burning through the darkness. And though few inside spoke of it aloud, everyone understood what it meant. The war was turning. Victory was no longer a question of if, but when. The breaking point. For Germany, the realization came not from a battle, but from arithmetic. No strategy, no weapon, no act of courage could counter the relentless flood of Allied production. Every destroyed tank was replaced within weeks. Every shot-down bomber was rebuilt before the pilot's funeral. The Reich's vision of technological dominance, its belief in superiority through design, had met its nemesis, superiority through scale. By the beginning of 1945, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a coherent force. Its remaining aircraft hid under trees or in caves. The air belonged to the bombers, and the bombers belonged to the factories. Willow Run had done what generals could not. It had broken the back of the German war machine. And in the shadow of that victory lay a paradox. The cost of triumph measured not just in lives, but in the soul of industry itself. The war would soon end, but the echoes of Willow Run, its thunder, its light, and its haunting perfection, would linger long after the last engine fell silent.
The war's end came quietly to Willow Run. In August 1945, after years of noise and flame, the line finally slowed. The final B-24 Liberator, tail number 44-5-1228, rolled out beneath a ceiling of silence. Workers gathered around it, unsure whether to cheer or weep. They had spent 4 years living by the rhythm of the line, the pulse of engines, the endless demand for more. And now, suddenly, it was over. Outside, the Michigan summer was bright and humid. News spread across the loudspeakers. Japan had surrendered. Men threw their caps into the air. Women hugged and cried. The sirens that had once called them to work now sounded in celebration. For the first time in years, Willow Run was quiet. Between 1942 and 1945, 8,685 B-24 Liberators had left its runways, more aircraft than most nations produced during the entire war. Each one represented not just industrial strength, but collective will. The plant had turned ordinary citizens into engineers, welders, riveters, and machinists. It had proven that democracy, when mobilized, could wield power greater than any empires. But as the bombers disappeared into history, the question remained, what would become of the arsenal of democracy now that peace had returned? The aftermath of victory. Almost overnight, government contracts were canceled. The massive orders that had fueled Detroit's economy evaporated. Willow Run, once the beating heart of American production, found itself without a purpose. Within months, tens of thousands of workers were laid off. The same assembly line that had once symbolized unity and purpose now stood empty. The hangars echoed with the ghosts of motion, the metallic hum replaced by silence and the faint drip of condensation from the roof. Henry Ford, who had resisted the war's beginning and lived to see its end, was no longer the visionary of old. His health and mind were failing. His son, Edsel, the man who had shepherded Willow Run through its most difficult days, had died in 1943, worn down by stress and illness. For the Ford family, victory came with deep personal loss. The company turned its eyes back to peace. Cars returned to the lines at Dearborn. Civilians wanted color again, chrome, comfort, and calm. But Willow Run was too vast for ordinary production. It was a monument to wartime necessity, not consumer life. The War Assets Administration considered dismantling it altogether. Some proposed turning it into a civil airport, others into storage for surplus equipment. For a time, it served as a transitional facility, repairing returned aircraft and salvaging parts. But the shadow of what it had achieved remained. The world had changed. While Willow Run fell silent, its legacy thundered on. Across the United States, the methods it pioneered, modular subassembly, precision tooling, just-in-time logistics, became the foundation of post-war industry. The idea of building complex machines at automotive speed had been proven. Aircraft design leapt forward. Jet engines, guided missiles, and early computers all borrowed from the lessons learned inside its walls. Engineers who had trained at Willow Run went on to work in the new aerospace frontier at Boeing, North American, and Convair. Even the automobile industry itself changed. The discipline and scale demanded by war production had shown manufacturers how to produce faster, safer, and more efficiently. The post-war boom, the glittering highways, the suburban dream, all drew energy from the factories that once built bombers. And overseas, the consequences of that industrial power were written into the landscape of the defeated Reich. The ruins of Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden bore witness to what mass production could do when unleashed in war. Albert Speer, writing from Spandau prison years later, admitted it plainly. We could not compete with a system that produced more machines than we had men to fight them. The war had ended not just through battle, but through arithmetic, through the overwhelming flood of machines born from places like Willow Run. The quiet glory. In the months that followed VJ Day, a few hundred workers remained to shut down the Great Line. They cleaned tools, sealed crates, and repainted the floor. For many, it was like dismantling a cathedral. Some took home fragments, a rivet, a gauge, a small piece of aluminum, tokens of a world they had helped to build. When the final lights went out, the mile-long factory stood like a sleeping giant. Grass began to grow through the cracks in the runway. The last echo of engines faded into the wind. But even in stillness, Willow Run carried a strange beauty, the beauty of human unity under impossible pressure, of a people who had turned their skill and exhaustion into victory. The arsenal of democracy had done its work, and now it faced its greatest challenge: what to do when the enemy was gone.
In the years after 1945, the immense factory that had once symbolized America's will to fight began a slow transformation. The thunder of engines was gone, replaced by the faint echoes of footsteps across cavernous halls. But the world had changed forever, and so too would Willow Run. The site was too vast, too perfectly engineered to remain idle for long. In 1946, the U.S. government leased sections of the facility to commercial manufacturers. First came Kaiser Frazer, one of the new automakers rising in the post-war boom. Using the existing lines, they built sedans instead of bombers.
For a brief time, the sound of progress returned. Stamping presses, conveyor belts, the hum of civilian life reborn. Yet even as cars rolled off the line, the plant's identity as a wartime giant never faded. The hangars still smelled faintly of oil and aluminum. The giant runways, once alive with Liberators, now saw test drives and delivery trucks. The people of Michigan called it the factory that saved the world. And in many ways, it had. The Cold War reawakening. By the 1950s, as the Cold War deepened, Willow Run found a new purpose. The United States Air Force and the University of Michigan converted parts of the complex into research and development centers. Here, the next generation of warfare quietly took shape. Engineers worked on early warning systems, radar surveillance, and even the foundations of America's first air defense computer networks, precursors to what would later become the digital age. The Willow Run Research Center became a hub of innovation. It studied atmospheric physics, missile guidance, and aerospace engineering. The ghosts of the past, those who had built bombers by hand, seemed to whisper through the steel walls as their descendants built machines that could think. In a strange symmetry, the plant that had once symbolized industrial might now became a birthplace for technological intelligence, shifting from sheer production to precision, from mass to mind. The human story. For the men and women who had once filled its floors, the memory of wartime work never left them. They spoke of the exhaustion, the camaraderie, the shared purpose that bound them through long nights and brutal winters. Many described the strange silence that followed demobilization, the shock of peace after years of noise. Some never found work that felt as meaningful again. Others carried the discipline and pride they learned into their post-war lives, building businesses, raising families, and teaching their children what it meant to build for something larger than oneself. In later years, reunions were held near the old site. Veterans of the production line, the Riveters, and the men who'd assembled wings and engines gathered to tell stories. They brought faded photographs and fragments of metal polished smooth with age. Their pride was quiet but deep. They hadn't fought on battlefields, but they had fought, in their own way, with drills, hammers, and sweat. The end of an era. By the 1960s, Willow Run had entered its final industrial chapter. The automotive companies moved on, newer plants rose elsewhere, and the original lines were slowly dismantled. Sections of the complex became storage depots, others fell into disuse. And yet, through decades of change, its symbolism endured. When historians spoke of the arsenal of democracy, they spoke of Willow Run first, of how one plant, born from the fields of Michigan, had proved that industrial might could shape the destiny of nations. In 2014, long after its engines had gone quiet, parts of Willow Run were demolished, but a section of the historic hangar was preserved, transformed into the Yankee Air Museum, dedicated to the workers who had once built bombers there. Inside, visitors can stand beneath the curved steel beams where the B-24s once took shape, and imagine the sound, the roar of thousands working in rhythm, the hiss of rivet guns, the hum of America at full power. The floor is quiet now, but the air still seems to vibrate with memory. Legacy of steel and spirit. The true legacy of Willow Run was never the machines themselves, but the lesson they embodied, that democracy, when threatened, could become a force of immense unity. In the crucible of war, it proved that ordinary people, mechanics, teachers, farmers, women who had never held a wrench before, could rise to build the impossible. It showed that victory wasn't only won by generals or soldiers, but by the millions who stood behind them, hidden in factories, working by the clock and by faith. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was proof that freedom could organize, innovate, and endure. And when the world's darkest moment passed, its walls remained, a silent monument to what humanity can achieve when it refuses to surrender. When the fires of war finally faded, Willow Run stood as both symbol and paradox, a temple of industry built for destruction, yet remembered for salvation. Its engines had powered not only aircraft, but a national awakening. The story of Willow Run was never just about machinery. It was about people, about hands that shaped rivets, eyes that measured tolerances by instinct, hearts that carried the weight of a world at war. In its echoing halls, America discovered that courage could take the form of labor, and that patriotism could be measured not only in medals, but in hours worked through fatigue and fear. There was no glory in its exhaustion, only purpose, and perhaps that was its greatest lesson, that unity born of necessity can reveal the best of what humanity is capable of. And when the engines finally went silent, they left behind not an echo of war, but a blueprint for peace, forged in thunder, remembered in steel, and carried forward in the quiet hands of those who built it.